guys, today I'm going to attempt to rehabilitate my mom's phalinopsis orchid. As you can see, it has lots of healthy looking aerial roots growing out of the top, but the leaves are more floppy than an orchid should be, which at first makes you think that it is dehydrated. And it is dehydrated, but not because it wasn't watered enough. For the rehabilitation today, I'm going to need hydrogen peroxide, a couple of tea bags, which you see here on the table, and some orchid potting mix. I went with Miracle-Gro, partly because that's the only orchid potting mix I could find at the store, and partly because it includes fertilizer so that I don't have to feed it for the first 6 months. When I got this plant, it was potted in this shredded bark potting medium, which is really common for orchids. The good thing is that it wasn't potted in sphagnum moss. Sphagnum moss is what a lot of growing centers pot their orchids in because they retain moisture and make it possible to water the orchids less often. The problem is they retain too much moisture for orchids. Orchids are native to places where they grow on the sides of trees, and their roots are generally exposed to air all of the time. So in a pot, you don't want them sitting in water. When I got this orchid, I pulled it out of its pot. Of course, it was full of this potting mix. And I pulled the potting mix out from between all of the roots. And what I found was that, first of all, it was full of water. I think that my mom noticed how limp the leaves were and started watering it more to try to make up for what was looking dehydrated. She was trying to make it better and ended up just with water sitting in the bottom of the pot. So these roots have unfortunately rotted. Some of these I've already taken the covering off of. These little skinny things are the actual root, and around the root they have this covering called velinum. And in the ones that have been rotted, the velinum is no longer this silvery green color. It's yellow or brown, and for a lot of them the velinum is kind of a papery. I just peeled this right off of this root. It's kind of become papery. It's not firm anymore. These are firm and hard, and the velinum acts like a sponge. It unconditionally lets in water like a sponge, but it doesn't let water out. So that's how it's different from a sponge. The problem with that is that if it's sitting in water, they soak up way too much water and can't let it out. So then they just kind of rot. But what we can do is pull the velinum off of the roots. Some people just clip those roots off, but I would like to have a little bit more structure for the orchid to hang on to in the pot. So I'm trying to leave any of them that I can. I'm going to pull the velinum off of any others where it's soft. Here it's soft. I can feel that there's nothing really inside there. I'm going to pull the velinum off and try to leave the roots, and then we'll do the next step. We know now why the plant isn't getting the moisture that it needs. The roots, when they rot, are no longer able to soak up moisture and get the plant the nutrients and the moisture that it needs. My mom's question is, why did that happen? There are a number of reasons. Sometimes if it's watered too much, that can happen if the water just sits at the bottom. But my mom is really good about watering this very little and letting it dry out between watering. So what I think happened was that this potting mix that it's been in is the same potting mix that it's been in since she got it, which has been about 2 years. And even this potting mix, which is the right kind for orchids, it's mostly bark and it's pretty coarse, it degrades over time. This is biological material, it decays. And as it decays, it becomes more acidic. And the acid just becomes too much for the roots and kind of fries them. So we'll just replace it. We're going to repot the orchid with some new potting mix that is also coarse like this, but it's fresh and not acidic. We want to clean off all of the old potting mix so that we don't mix it into the new. And we also want to continue to water it sparingly so that we don't turn the new potting mix acidic by increasing the rate of decay. Before I repot the orchid into the new potting mix, I'm going to soak it in a mixture of water and hydrogen peroxide. The reason for that is this. Hydrogen peroxide has more oxygen in it than water, and that's really the only difference between hydrogen peroxide and water. In water, you have two hydrogen atoms for each oxygen atom in a molecule. In H2O2, which is hydrogen peroxide, you have two hydrogen atoms and 2 oxygen atoms in each molecule. So it adds oxygen to the roots, and it also helps discourage the growth of fungus, which may be the cause of some of this rot. So in here I have a pint of water and 1 fluid ounce of hydrogen peroxide. That's a good mixture. You don't want too much hydrogen peroxide. So I'm going to soak it like this. I'm going to make sure to leave these aerial roots out. And let me just say something about aerial roots. We call them aerial roots because they grow outside the pot, but in nature, where an orchid grows naturally, all of its roots are aerial roots. It doesn't grow inside a pot or under the dirt. It grows on the side of a tree. So this really, aerial roots just refers to an orchid, a cultivated orchid in a pot, and the roots that grow up and outside the pot. So I'm going to leave these out of the water because they are not accustomed to being soaked, and changing their environment that rapidly could cause some damage to them. I'm going to soak these roots that were underground in the pot. Just carefully get them all in there. And we'll just soak him in there for a few minutes. All right, this has been soaking for about 5 minutes, and I'm going to take it out now. But it's not quite ready to be potted yet. I'm going to dump this in the sink. And next I'm going to soak it in tea. I've taken these 2 tea bags, put some hot water in here. The water is now cooled off. Waited for the water to cool to room temperature. So I put the tea in there. I'm going to add some water to dilute it just a little bit. And now we will soak the orchid, again putting the roots, only the roots that were in the pot, into the liquid. And the thing about tea is that it contains a lot of tannic acid. The tannic acid will encourage the plant to begin creating more roots to make up for these that will probably not be able to absorb water for the plant. It does have a few roots that are still good and still have the vellum covering on them, but really only a couple that are nice and long. This one does have new growth on it, so that's encouraging, but we will soak it in the tea for tannic acid for a few hours, actually, longer than the hydrogen peroxide. I just want it to really soak up some of that tannic acid and encourage it to grow. You could soak it even overnight if you wanted to encourage some new root growth for your orchid before you repot it. Okay, so this has soaked for about 4 or 5 hours in the tea solution, and now it's ready to be repotted. I'm going to pot it back in its original pot. It has the outer pot with no holes in it, and the inside pot has a lot of holes in it to ensure really good drainage. This is specifically made for for orchids. Normally, I wouldn't worry too much about scrubbing it and making sure it's really clean after it's been in this pot. This is its own pot it's going back into. But since it had root rot and there may have been fungus present in there, I scrubbed these up really well and rinsed them in a water and vinegar solution before we got started here. So I'm going to start by putting the inner pot inside the other pot and just putting some of the potting mix in the bottom. I don't want to put too much because these roots are going to go almost to the very bottom of the pot, the couple of roots that are still left. And when I put it in the pot, I want to make sure that these aerial roots, remember they're only aerial roots because this is a cultivated orchid, not a wild one. But these aerial roots are going to stay out of the pot because that's what they're used to, and we don't want to shock them. But the roots that are still viable that were in the pot, I'm going to make sure those go down back into the pot. Okay, so now the trick is to get the bark, the potting medium, down into the holes between roots and just fill it up the best you can all around and under the plant. Okay, so now my mom's phalinopsis orchid has been repotted. It's full of the bark potting medium. It's also Miracle-Gro potting medium, so the fertilizer should last, it says up to 6 months. I don't know if really we want to test this. I might wait 4 months, or we'll just see how the plant is doing after a few months. But at this point, we'll go back to watering it only once a week. And what I like to do is to put an ice cube in the pot. I know, I'm sorry, my brother will not like that I'm putting ice cubes into my orchid, but it seems to work for me. I'll put an ice cube into the orchid at the top of the pot and it will melt slowly to water the roots really slowly over the course of the day. And we will see if we can get these leaves some rigidity back and maybe even a bloom or two. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe.